I was in middle school, my classmates played something called the Black Envelope. The game was invented by a bunch of Russian teenagers. The village they lived in had an urban legend about a demonic entity called Nadamet. The story goes that in the early 1900s, a man from the village got drunk one night and hooked up with some random woman. 20 years later, the man was visited by a demon humanoid who claimed to be his son. It turned out that the woman he was with all those years ago was a succubus looking for some hot action, if you catch my drift. The hybrid's name was Nadamet. By then, the man was married and had 2 kids. The oldest was 14-year-old Olga, and the youngest was 12-year-old Ivan. Nadamet explained that he wanted to meet his father and become part of his family. In return, he'd protect his father's village. Not wanting anything to do with his demonic son, the man declined and told him to never show up again. Before he left, Nadamet told his father how to reach him should he need him. All he needed was an envelope, paper, and a writing utensil. The following method is how the black envelope is played. The first step is to write a message addressed to Nadamet. The second is to place the note in the envelope and seal it. You must then draw an inverted pentagram on the face of the envelope. Once the letter is ready, it must be hidden somewhere dark, like in a drawer. At 3 a.m., the envelope will vanish from its hiding place. This means that the letter has been sent to Nadamet. At dawn, a black sealed envelope will appear in the same place you've hidden your letter. Inside the black envelope will be a red piece of chalk. Once you've obtained the chalk, you must use it to draw a pentagram on the floor. By drawing the pentagram, you're opening a portal for Nadamet to access Earth. Once he arrives, you must explain what you need him to do. How long it takes for Nadamet to fulfill one's wish varies between requests. Once Nadamet completes his mission, he will return to Hell. Nadamet's father swore to never summon his unholy spawn, but that changed when the Third Reich invaded Russia. The village wasn't too close to the eastern border. Regardless, it was only a matter of time before the Germans arrived. Fearing for his village, Nadamet's father felt that he had no choice but to summon his demonic son. It's unknown just how powerful Nadamet is. All we know is that it was enough to keep the Nazis from invading the village. The teenagers posted the Black Envelope story on the internet. By then, the internet was relatively new. Because it was the first urban legend to appear on the internet, the Black Envelope gained popularity seemingly overnight. People from around the world had played it. Of course, the Russian teens were the first to try it out. According to their testimonies, the boys asked for typical teenage things. Booze, money, girlfriends, you get the idea. The teenagers claimed that the Black Envelope worked. However, not everyone believed them. My friend Jim told me about this legend the week before we started middle school. He learned about it from an older cousin who lived in our neighborhood. Apparently, the kids in my hometown use the Black Envelope as some rite of passage. Around here, middle school marks the beginning of having more freedom and trust. I guess that made them feel entitled to whatever they wanted from Nadamet. I was skeptical when Jim told me about the Black Envelope, but one weekend I didn't have any plans. So to kill time, I decided to play the Black Envelope. I still wasn't convinced that Nadamet was real. To prove it, I asked Nadamet for something impossible. In my letter, I asked him to make a bear destroy Nate's bike. Nate was the bully from my school. For context, we live in a city. A bear would have to walk at least 10 miles into the city to reach Nate's house. Once I completed all the steps, I hid my letter in my closet. The next morning, I went to my closet expecting my letter to be there. But when I checked the spot where I left it, I felt my heart sink. Instead of a white envelope, a black one was in its place. My mind raced as I tried to understand how this happened. It couldn't have been my classmates. I never told anyone that I was playing the black envelope. Besides, how would they even know when I played it or where I hid my letter? With shaking hands, I picked up the black envelope and opened it. I reached into the envelope and felt something small and long inside. I hesitantly pulled the item out of the envelope. Sure enough, it was red chalk. I stood there trying to process it all. There's no way some stupid urban legend could be real, right? I called Jim and told him what happened. I expected him to admit that it was a prank, but instead, Jim got excited and told me that he'll be over soon. By the time he arrived at my house, our parents had gone out to drink. Good thing too, because I wouldn't know how to explain any of this to them. I told Jim what had happened and showed him the chalk. Jim was ecstatic when I told him what I asked Nonamet for. Nate treasured his bike, and Jim really wanted him to get his comeuppance. Since I had nothing to lose, I figured that I'd draw the pentagram. So I drew the inverted pentagram on my bedroom floor. When I was done, Jim and I stepped back. After 10 seconds of nothing, I was sure that Nonamet wasn't real. I was about to get something to clean the chalk when a blaze of fire suddenly ignited on the pentagram. When the fire went out, a red pit appeared in its place. A pale hand with claw-like nails emerged from it and gripped the edge. A horned man lifted himself out of the pit and climbed onto the floor. Jim and I watched in horror as this humanoid stood up. He was 7 feet tall, 7.5 if you include the length of his horns. His eyes were amber and cat-like. He was wearing traditional Slavic attire and had dark dragon-like wings. Jim and I stood there, gawking at the monster before us. In a Russian accent, he asked which one of us summoned him. Jim pointed at me before backing up. I couldn't believe it. Nonamet was in my house. Nonamet said that he'd read my letter and asked me about Nate. In a shaky voice, I told him about Nate and how he likes to pick on other kids. I couldn't tell Nonamet that I played his game despite not believing in him. The Cambion said that he admired my thirst for revenge. He vowed to fulfill my wish as soon as possible. Nonamet then opened my window and flew out. I watched as he soared into the horizon. After getting over the shock, I closed the window. Jim reminded me to cover the portal. Apparently it couldn't close until Nonamet used it to get back to hell. I had this rug in my room that was big enough to cover the portal, so I moved it over there for the time being. I went to bed that night, trying not to let the portal bother me. I was fast asleep when the sound of tapping woke me up. It took me about a minute to get up and realize what was happening. The tapping noise was coming from my window. It was already dawn, so I could barely see what was out there. But when I heard a familiar voice call my name, I knew exactly who it was. I opened the window, and Nonamet quietly entered my room. He told me that he'd fulfilled his duty and was ready to go home. I removed the rug from the portal, and Nonamet jumped in. The portal then disappeared, and I went back to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up and checked my phone. I saw that I got a text message from Jim. His message read, "Dude, you've got to see this." He also sent me a link to a YouTube video. I opened the link and found a video titled Bear vs. Bike. The video took place in a neighborhood at night. My jaw dropped when I saw a bear destroying a red bike. The video was being recorded from a house across the street. The house behind the bear had its lights on. Through one of its windows, I could see a freaked out Nate. Only then did I understand what was happening. The black envelope had worked. I laughed when I saw the bear chewing on the bike seat like a juicy steak. The video ended when a van from animal control appeared. Jim and I never told anyone how I was responsible for the incident, partly because no one would believe us. Also, I was worried that Nate would take his revenge on me if he found out. I'm telling you all this as a warning. Be very careful when playing the black envelope. I managed to do it without causing serious harm, but one wrong decision could have made it so much worse. It all started when I was hired for a haunted attraction. It's called Miss Amelia's House. This particular attraction was based on a true story. Back in the 1990s, there was a single mother named Edna. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Amelia. Edna worshipped Amelia. She loved her so much that she somehow developed the habit of calling her Miss Amelia. One day, the family took a plane to visit Edna's parents. Sadly, the aircraft crashed and Amelia didn't survive. Edna refused to leave her house and cried in her room for hours at a time. This went on for weeks until Edna finally left the house. It seemed that Edna had moved on from the tragedy. When a neighbor walked past Edna's place, he noticed something through one of the windows. Edna was sitting at her dining room table talking to someone. Curious, the neighbor decided to see who it was. What he saw baffled him. Sitting in the chair opposite from Edna was a doll. What made it creepy was that the doll looked precisely like Amelia. It even wore the same pink dress she wore when she died. Edna conversed with the doll as if it were her late daughter. Soon, everyone in town found out about Edna's insanity. Edna was taken to a psych ward. She lived there for a few months until she died one night. Some believed that Edna died of a broken heart. The story never explained what happened to the doll. I don't even know how my employer found it. All I can say is that the doll became part of the attraction. And let me tell you, the years had not been kind to it. The attraction was designed to look like Edna's old house, but scarier. Cobwebs, damaged walls, blood splatters, the works. The final room of the attraction was designed to look like Amelia's bedroom. The doll was laid on the bed with me sitting next to it. My job was to be Amelia's ghost. My character looked like her, but with a more zombie-like appearance. All I had to do was wait for patrons to show up in my area and jump out at them. When the attraction closed in November, I thought I'd never see that hideous doll again. But when I got up the next morning, I found it in my bed next to me. I was so scared that I fell off the bed. I stood up and stared at the thing in disbelief. I should mention that I have a roommate who worked in the same theme park as me. Her name is Grace. I figured Grace had stolen the doll and placed it in my bed while I was sleeping. I grabbed the doll and barged into Grace's room. You see, my roommate tends to pull dumb pranks sometimes. Being the non-morning person she was, Grace was still asleep. I asked what her problem was and threw the doll onto her bed. My outburst jolted Grace awake. She then flinched when she saw the doll on her bed. Grace asked me what was with the doll. I told Grace I knew she got the doll from Miss Amelia's house and stole it to scare me. Grace said that she had no idea what I was talking about. While we were arguing, the bedroom door slammed shut behind me, startling us both. I then heard what sounded like a child sniffling in the hallway outside. I opened the door and the sniffling stopped. I looked out in the hallway but didn't see anything. I wondered if it was my imagination when Grace called my name. She held up the doll and I saw what was bothering her. The doll's face was wet. It looked as if it had just cried. Terrified, Grace and I threw the doll in the trash. Lucky for us, the dumpster truck was coming the next day. We thought that would be the end of it, but 3 days later, we found the same doll on our couch. Neither of us could explain the doll's reappearance. By then, I was sure that Grace wasn't responsible. Jokester or not, even she wouldn't keep something up for this long. Suddenly, I heard the sobbing again. This time, Grace and I saw the doll crying. I then heard a faint voice asking where her mom was. I felt my heart sink as I realized it was coming from the doll. Grace grabbed the doll and then bolted out of our apartment. I ran after her, wondering what she was doing, but then I saw her get into her car and drive off. I tried to call her, but she wouldn't pick up. I was returning to our apartment when I ran into Mrs. Rose, one of our neighbors. She saw Grace running and asked if everything was okay. I told Mrs. Rose what had happened. I didn't expect Mrs. Rose to believe me, but after hearing my story, she told me something I never would have anticipated. Well, our building was built where Edna and Amelia's house used to be, Mrs. Rose said. My neighbor could tell from my baffled expression that I had no idea what she was talking about. It turned out that after Edna's death, her house was put up for sale. Within 5 years, 8 different families resided in the home. Each one claimed to be haunted by a child's ghost. The last family had a daughter around Amelia's age. Somehow, she found the Miss Amelia doll. The parents tried to get rid of the doll, but for some reason, it always reappeared in the house. The daughter told her parents that Miss Amelia was looking for her mom. Before moving away, the family sold the doll to a theme park. That was the same one I worked at. I think the doll didn't return earlier because nobody has lived in the house since. When the real estate agency failed to sell the house again, the city decided to replace it with an apartment building. I guess Amelia's ghost knew I lived where her home used to be and followed me back to my apartment. Mrs. Rose suggested that Amelia only haunted my place because it was where her bedroom was located. Amelia's house had only 1 floor. My apartment also happened to be on the ground level. Mrs. Rose also figured nobody lived in my apartment before Grace and me. There's no way to prove whether my neighbor was correct or not. Regardless, I had to figure out how to get rid of Miss Amelia. Finally, Grace called me back. She said that she took the Miss Amelia doll to a psychic. According to the psychic, we had to take the Miss Amelia doll to Edna. Only then could Amelia's soul finally rest. There were 2 problems with that. First off, I never believed in psychics. And second, Edna is dead. Grace suggested that we take the Miss Amelia doll to Edna's grave. Since we had nothing to lose, I agreed to Grace's plan. I won't bore you with how we managed to find Edna's grave. When we did, I placed the doll in front of the tombstone. I then heard a child's giggle and something caught my eye. A woman and young girl walked away hand in hand before disappearing into nothingness. I don't know if anyone will believe my story, but all that matters is that Amelia is with her mom again. I'm an experienced in-home nurse. In 5 years, I've encountered a variety of patients. I'll admit, there were some problematic ones, but I chalked it up to them being irritated with their respective medical problems. Overall, I'm happy with my career, but there was this one patient that nearly drove me to quit. Her name was Mrs. Perrywood. I was hired to look after Mrs. Perrywood by her son, George. He needed someone to stay with his mom while he was on a business trip. I should clarify that George wanted someone to stay in Mrs. Perrywood's house during the trip. For context, the company I work for is the kind where nurses are available 24/7. I was selected to take care of Mrs. Perrywood. George promised to pay the company and me a hefty sum once he returned from his trip. When I arrived at her house, I was amazed by its appearance. Mrs. Perrywood's home was like a mansion. George met me outside and invited me into his home. Once inside, he explained the situation to me. George owned a successful business and lived on his own, but recently, he learned that his mom wasn't doing so well. George loved his mom, so he moved back in with her. He needed a nurse while on his business trip in case anything happened. I was touched by George's story. I respected him for caring so much for his mother's well-being to the point where he'd live with her. George led me to his mother's room. Mrs. Perrywood was sitting in her bed reading a book when we entered her room. She turned to face us and smiled. George approached his mom and kissed her on the cheek. He then gestured for me to come forward and introduced me. Before leaving, George gave me his number in case of any emergencies. The first day was great. Mrs. Perrywood was the sweetest woman I'd ever met. All we did was talk about our lives and families. During one of our conversations, Mrs. Perrywood mentioned that she had an older son named James. James stopped visiting her some time ago. He even stopped talking to George. Neither Mrs. Perrywood nor George could understand the sudden estrangement. I felt sorry for the family. How could James abandon them like that? That night, I slept in the bedroom next to Mrs. Perrywood's. I don't know why, but I woke up in the middle of the night. At the time, I happened to be facing the direction of the bedroom door. I immediately sat up when I saw a silhouette in the middle of the room. I turned on the lamp on the nightstand and was relieved to see that it was Mrs. Perrywood. I asked Mrs. Perrywood what she was doing up. She said that she wanted to make sure that I didn't leave. I helped her back to her bed. It wasn't until I got back to bed that it finally dawned on me. Mrs. Perrywood had trouble walking, and I kept my door open in case she needed something. If Mrs. Perrywood had tried to walk alone, she would have fallen. If she did, the thud from the impact would have woken me up. I also wondered why she wanted to make sure that I was still around. I was always loyal to my clients. Did she not trust me? One morning, I was having breakfast with Mrs. Perrywood when I heard someone banging on the door. I then heard an older man's voice calling George's name. I could tell by his tone that he was furious. I grabbed my phone and went to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a well-dressed man with blonde hair. He ordered George to let him in. I yelled at the intruder, telling him to leave or I'd call the cops. He stopped banging and looked confused. The man asked who I was and what I was doing in his mom's house. I explained who I was and that I was a nurse hired by George. The intruder stood there, looking as if I had said something unbelievable. He introduced himself as James, George's brother. I was surprised. The guy who disappeared from his family's life suddenly reappeared on his mom's doorstep. James asked where George was. I told him that George was on a business trip and wouldn't be home for a few days. James facepalmed and muttered something under his breath. He then got into his car and drove away. I got a bad feeling and called George. After telling him what happened, George told me that he would deal with James. When George returned from his business trip, I was watching TV with Mrs. Perrywood. We were commenting on the terrible acting in an old show when we heard a screaming match from outside. I went to the front door to investigate. I looked through the peephole and saw George and James arguing. The house was on the outskirts of my town, so there were no neighbors around. "How many times do I have to tell you, George?" James yelled. "Mom doesn't need a nurse." "Mom has struggled to move for the past month, James," George argued back. "It's not like you'd been any help." I was about to grab my phone to call the police when James shouted something that shook me to my core. "I can't help Mom because she's dead," James screamed. I felt my heart sink. I turned around and saw Mrs. Perrywood standing behind me. Her skin was pale, her hair was a ratty mess, and her clothes were tattered. In a raspy voice, she thanked me for spending time with her. I screamed and ran out of the house. James caught me and asked what had happened. I struggled to tell James about Mrs. Perrywood. He didn't understand a word I said. George, however, knew exactly what was going on and explained everything. It turned out that Mrs. Perrywood had died of heart complications a month prior, but despite her death, Mrs. Perrywood never left her home. Her spirit stayed in the house with George. When George told James about it, he didn't believe him. James thought that his brother was in denial. That's why he stopped visiting the house. I noticed James looking at the house in horror. George and I followed his eyes and saw Mrs. Perrywood in one of the windows. She smiled and waved at us. The three of us vowed to never speak of Mrs. Perrywood's ghost. The last thing we wanted was to scare an entire town. I haven't seen or heard from the Perrywood brothers since that day. All I know is that neither of them hired a nurse again. Later, I learned that Mrs. Perrywood's death wasn't made public before I was hired. After returning home, George announced his mother's death and held a funeral for her. As far as I know, Mrs. Perrywood's spirit is still with George. I also feel that this new revelation helped George and James reconcile. At least I can rest easy knowing that no other nurse would go through what I went through. I don't know how to feel about what happened. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad my neighbors got the closure they needed, but the outcome also became the reason I moved to another state. Sure, a different city would have sufficed, but after what I've been through, I don't want to be anywhere near my hometown. I don't want to say its name. I am, however, willing to tell you what happened there. It all began 4 years ago. I was thinking of starting a garage sale, so I looked for things to get rid of. I started in the attic, which had more clutter than the basement. I was looking around when I found something wedged between two boxes. I knelt down and saw that it was a disposable camera. I'd never used the camera. I wasn't even sure how it got in my attic. Another strange thing about the camera was that the label was removed. I concluded that it was left behind by my house's previous owner. However, there was one thing wrong with that. I'd lived in that house for several months by then. Plus, the attic was completely empty when I moved in. The camera was dusty, as if it had been there for years. The only thing I could think of doing was getting its photos printed. I figured that whatever images the camera captured would help me identify its owner. Whoever it was may even want the pictures back. So I took the pictures to get developed. When I got the photos, I was a bit confused. For those who don't know, a disposable camera roll can take up to 27 pictures. The camera was full and each pic was of random locations. Most of them were of buildings like restaurants and hotels. I recognized these places as they were all in my hometown. For context, I lived in a big city. I figured the photographer was some tourist, but that still wouldn't explain why the camera was in my house. As I examined the photos, I noticed something in each one. There was this strange blur in the background. These blurs were a dark shade of blue. I don't know how long I've been trying to analyze these forms. When I gave up, I decided to hand them to my brother, John. He was a police officer. When I showed the photos to John, he thanked me for giving them to him. Noticing my confused face, John directed my attention to one of the photos. It was of a movie theater a few blocks from my neighborhood. John then pointed at the signs above the entrance. It was one of those theaters that list the names of whatever movies are playing there. In this photo, the sign read, "Now showing Beetlejuice." If you're too young to remember, Beetlejuice came out in 1988. This meant that the picture was taken that year. John explained that there was a cold case that involved locations in every one of the pictures. In 1988, there was a series of murder cases in our city. 27 people were found dead in the exact locations these pictures were taken. Each victim was stabbed through the heart. It was as if they were impaled with a katana. The victims didn't have anything in common. Their ages ranged between 25 and 38. The first body was found behind a hotel on March 17th. Every day since then, a new victim had been found daily, but for some reason, the killer stopped after the 27th victim. Each victim was stabbed through the heart. It was as if they were impaled with some katana. The victims didn't have anything in common. Their ages ranged between 25 and 38. The first body was found behind a hotel on March 17th. Every day since then, a new victim has been found daily. But for some reason, the killer stopped after their 27th victim. The police never caught the perp. I asked John what he thought of the blurs in each photo. Unfortunately, he was just as clueless. Our best bet was to have the police examine the images. John suggested that the pictures could have been taken by the killer himself. As for the blurs, they could have been smudges or something. Days passed, and I eventually forgot about the incident. In my hometown, I worked in a local cinema. I was cleaning one of the empty theaters when I heard a strange noise. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. As I followed the noise, I realized it was a song never be used again. In the rural parts of America stands an old castle. It was discovered by Leif Erikson in the early 11th century. The castle had a Gothic design. What made it strange was that this was before the architectural style even existed. Leif was baffled to find a castle with no kingdom. It seemed to him that the place was abandoned. To be sure, Leif and his men entered the palace. The place seemed empty, but for some reason, all the candles were lit. The castle was clean and furnished. Even the kitchen was full of fresh food. One of Leif's men, Olaf, wanted to check the wine cellar and grab some bottles. By then, everyone was convinced that the castle was uninhabited. Everyone except Leif. He didn't know why, but the Norsemen had a bad feeling. When Olaf returned, he insisted on fleeing the castle. He claimed that something evil lived there, but wouldn't say what. From that day on, the castle earned the name Sinister Palace. For centuries, humanity avoided the castle. But one day, the United Nations decided to investigate Sinister Palace. It turned out that people from all over the world had been exploring the castle. However, none of them were ever heard from again. One of the missing people was a college student named Jenny Woods. She was a huge fan of urban legends, so when she heard about Sinister Palace, Jenny had to check it out. Before leaving for the castle, Jenny asked her friends to join her. They all declined, but that didn't stop her. Jenny drove to Sinister Palace alone one Saturday morning. The last anyone heard from her was through a text she'd sent to her mother. The text read, "I have found my true home in the world below the palace." A whole day passed and Jenny didn't return home. Her parents tried to contact her many times, but their calls and texts couldn't reach Jenny's phone for some reason. It was as if the phone was either turned off or destroyed. The authorities went to look for Jenny the following day. The first place they looked was Sinister Palace. Jenny's car was still parked in front of the castle. The police suspected that someone was holding Jenny captive in Sinister Palace. With their guns drawn, the police quietly infiltrated the castle. The place was in the same condition as it was over 1,000 years ago. When the police went down to the cellar, they found something. There was an old-fashioned door in the back of the room. One of the officers opened the door and everyone was appalled by what they'd found. There was a forest. However, this wasn't the same as the one near the castle. The forest wasn't the only thing that was off. The whole environment was abnormal. The sky was red, the grass was black, and the plants were very different from Earth's. The police speculated that Jenny had found this place and got lost in it. One of the officers, named Benson, claimed that he knew of someone who could help them. Her name was Erna J. Weissman. Erna was a German immigrant who was down on her luck. She tried to make a living through online courses. The topics of the respective courses were German, history, and mythology. Despite the significant amount of research and effort she'd put into her work, Erna struggled to make ends meet. Benson was one of the few people who took her mythology course. He recalled a lesson that talked about portals to other worlds. Benson suggested that the police bring Erna to Sinister Palace to save Jenny. Benson believed that Erna could help the police locate Jenny. After some convincing, the chief of police reached out to her. Erna arrived at Sinister Palace in a police car. The German was in awe when she gazed upon the castle. Erna was very familiar with the legend of Sinister Palace. She also knew of the door in the cellar. Erna explained that Sinister Palace had many visitors after Leif Erikson. Many people who visited America stumbled upon Sinister Palace. Native Americans, Christopher Columbus, European settlers, and so on. Everyone who entered this castle found the portal. Some have even ventured into the unknown world, but not too far. Those who'd done so claimed to have found monstrous beings. Many believed that the door was a portal to the underworld. When Erna heard that someone was trapped there, she came prepared. Erna brought her handgun, a hammer, and 2 duffel bags full of wooden stakes. Erna and some officers would go into the portal to look for Jenny. The wooden stakes would be used as markers to prevent the search party from getting lost. Once the search party was organized, Erna led the chosen officers into the underworld while the rest stayed behind. Every 10 feet, Erna hammered a stake into the ground. After the second stake, the party encountered its first creature. It looked like a deer, but with a more disturbing appearance. Erna identified the monster as a skull creeper. Skull creepers are deer-like entities with black fur and a skull for a head. Its red eyes gawked at the humans before walking away. Erna assured the officers that the monsters in that land won't attack them unless they were attacked first. However, this only applied to animal-based monsters. One of the officers asked Erna if she knew exactly where they were. She explained that there's only one place in the underworld with vegetation like the kind the party was surrounded with. According to Erna, the forest was in a place called Genositco. The only potentially dangerous entities that lived there were the Nerovamps. Nerovamps are a species of female daywalker vampires. Not much is known about them apart from a few things. For example, each Nerovamp has a unique set of powers. They also don't turn just by being bitten on the neck like regular vampires. However, it's unknown how one becomes a Nerovamp. Erna admitted that she brought her own gun because the bullets were blessed by a priest. Unlike the officers' bullets, Erna's could actually kill a Nerovamp. The officers' bullets could cause some pain, thus distracting the entities, but that's all. Erna had used the last stake of her first duffel bag when she and her party found something. There was a temple made of obsidian with a glass dome roof. Erna warned the others that there was dark energy coming from the temple. Thinking that Jenny could be in the temple, the whole party drew their weapons. The officers followed Erna as she approached the large wooden doors. She grabbed the handles and slowly opened them. Lit braziers hung from the columns inside the temple. The wall in the back of the room had a purple banner and a symbol that looked like 2 overlapping pentacles. In the center of the temple was a well-like pool full of glowing liquid. The substance was lavender in color and smelled like eucalyptus. The police saw what was in the pool and asked what it was. Erna said that it may be a potion of some kind and advised everyone not to touch it. The main room had 3 corridors. The search party was divided into groups of 4. The groups called out to Jenny as they ventured down their respective paths. Erna's group found itself in a library. The German examined one of the shelves and concluded that all the books were about mystical topics, like spells and monsters. As Erna and her group investigated the library, a soft voice grabbed their attention. A young woman called out to the temple's visitors, asking for help. Thinking that it was Jenny, everyone ran out to the halls. But as they did so, all the candles suddenly went out. In the darkness, something attacked the party. One officer fired his gun straight ahead. In the brief flash of the gun's light, everyone caught a glimpse of what was happening. Women with gray skin attacked the search party. Everyone struggled in the darkness, trying to fight off their attackers. The officers screamed in pain as they felt something pierce their skin. It was during the chaos that Benson saw something. A light purple glow was emitting not too far from him. Benson recognized it as the pool near the main entrance. He fired at his assailant before pushing it off of him. Benson then booked it to the front doors, which were still open. Benson ran out of the temple and along Erna's path. He kept running until he returned to the cellar. Benson passed out from exhaustion before anyone could ask what happened. When Benson woke up, he found himself in a hospital bed. The doctor explained that an officer called an ambulance after Benson blacked out. The doctor said that Benson was in good health. He then asked about the puncture wounds on Benson's shoulder. The doctor showed Benson the wounds. Benson's heart raced as he remembered what had happened. He told the doctor about Sinister Palace and everything that had happened. As Benson told his story, a horrible realization dawned on him. He asked the doctor if anyone from his search party survived. The doctor shook his head. Benson was the only person who returned from the portal. Benson laid there, overwhelmed by what he'd been through. He thought back to the temple, recalling every second of what transpired. Benson felt guilty for leaving his party behind. But what really got to him was that he dragged Erna into that mess. That was the moment Benson decided to make everything right. He didn't know if anyone from the search party was still alive, but Benson vowed to go back to Sinister Palace and save everyone. I've been a 911 operator for about 6 years now. People tend to ask me what the most disturbing call I ever got was. In my case, a collection of them deserve that title. Around the time I started my career, there were some strange murder cases. People have been found dead with bizarre wounds on them. Police described the injuries as if something small and hot shot through the victims. But the weirdest thing is that these murders have been happening worldwide. The FBI believes that an international crime syndicate is behind these murders. Being a rational person, I thought the same thing, but one disturbing incident proved me wrong. I should start by explaining that my shifts end at 10 p.m. I get to and from work by bus. The nearest bus stop to my workplace is a 20-minute walk. I'm telling you this because my story wouldn't have happened if not for this. I was heading to the bus stop after another shift when I felt like someone was watching me. I always keep pepper spray on me whenever I leave my house. At the time, I was wearing a jacket. The pepper spray was in the jacket's right pocket. I placed my hands in my jacket pockets, grabbing the spray just in case. There was a park between my workplace and the bus stop. I was walking past the park when I saw someone. There was this person in the park, walking in the same direction as me. They were too far from the streetlights for me to see their features. I could tell the person was an adult with a hood covering their head. Whoever it was didn't seem to notice me. Regardless, I had to keep my guard up. I didn't feel safe until I was on the bus. Since the stranger didn't follow me, I was convinced that they weren't after me. A few days passed and I forgot about the incident. But one night during my shift, I got a call from someone in my neighborhood. I didn't know him, but we lived on the same street. I'll call him Rick for the story. Rick claimed that a dangerous person was stalking him. He said that someone named Exdominus was going to kill him. Confused, I asked who Exdominus was. According to Rick, Exdominus is a bloodthirsty entity who travels the world in search of victims. Her murder weapon is a ray gun too advanced to be from Earth. She also wore a red metal mask that covered her whole face save for her golden eyes. Rick begged me to send the police. I never believed in urban legends. Still, I had to send a unit to Rick's house. Mythological being or not, it was my duty to help him. I told Rick to lock himself in a room and hide. Rick locked his bedroom door and hid in his closet. I tried to calm Rick down as we waited for the police. Suddenly, I heard a loud bam coming from the call. I realized that someone was trying to break into Rick's room. There were a couple more bangs, followed by what sounded like the door being busted off its hinges. My heart raced as I heard Rick's bated breath. I'm not sure how long we've been like that. Every time I was in a moment like that, time seemed non-existent. Suddenly, I heard one more bang, followed by Rick's scream, then silence. There was another sound between the bang and the scream. It was like the laser cannons on a starfighter from Star Wars. However, it was more brief and high-pitched. I tried to pinpoint the source when the call got disconnected. You don't have to be a genius to know it was the killer. I couldn't process what had just happened. I was in the break room when Lisa, one of my colleagues, asked if I was alright. I told her about Rick and the weird noise I heard. When I described the sound, Lisa's face went pale. She told me that it was Exdominus' ray gun that I heard. "Please tell me that you don't believe in that myth," I groaned. Lisa said that she'd seen Exdominus. Not in person, but through her brother's security footage. Lisa had a brother named Johnny. His house had security cameras in every room. One day, Lisa received the news that her brother had been killed in his own home. When the police reviewed the security footage, they were shocked by what they found. They started at around 11 p.m. Since Johnny was still awake, the living room lights were on. Someone dressed in black punched through the living room window, shattering the glass. They then unlocked the window and opened it. Someone dressed in black crawled through the window. A red metal mask covered their whole face. The intruder pulled a gun out of their holster before creeping around the house. Based on the footage, the police confirmed that it was an adult woman. Johnny was in the shower when the break-in occurred. The bathroom was on the second floor of Johnny's house. He couldn't hear anything between the running water and the window being downstairs. The intruder must have heard the shower because they went straight to the bathroom. The door was wide open. As soon as the intruder reached the bathroom, she fired at the shower, killing Johnny. The police zoomed in on the firearm to identify it. However, nobody had a clue as to what it was. The weapon looked like a red handheld gun, but with a more futuristic look, as the police put it. The footage of the murder was on the news the following day. Lisa showed me the video on her phone. The killer looked like the one Rick described. Even the sound of the firearm in the video matched the one I heard in that call. This woman matched Exdominus' description to a T, but there's one thing that the video and 911 call couldn't prove. If this was the real deal, how can we tell it's a mythical being? As far as I was concerned, it was some lunatic impersonating Exdominus. I told Lisa this and asked if she was sure that it was her. Lisa admitted that she didn't believe it either, but then she did some research and shared her sources with me. After my shift, I looked into the sources Lisa emailed me. There were a few amateur videos of Exdominus. The first video was in a forest and pointed at the sky. According to the description, the person recording was waiting for the monarch butterfly migration when something else flew by. It moved so fast that I had to pause the video to examine it. The video's quality was poor, but I could see Exdominus. The wings were big and black, kind of like a dragon's. The second video took place at a warehouse at night. Whoever recorded this one used a camera with night vision. I can't say too much about what was in the description because it might cause legal problems. Let's just say that some politician, which we'll call John, was involved in illegal activity. This warehouse was where John did his dealings. The cameraman was somewhere high and hard to detect, like a cliff or something. At least this video's quality was better than the last one's. Anyway, some gangsters were hanging around the warehouse. John then pulls up and exits his car. The camera was too far to pick up what anyone was saying. The camera then moved upward and something came flying toward the warehouse. When it landed on the roof, I recognized it as Exdominus. John and the gangsters noticed her and drew their weapons. Exdominus stared at the gangsters as one of them shouted at her. A few seconds later, the gangster who spoke shot Exdominus. The assassin didn't go down as I anticipated. The gangster fired a few more rounds and she was still standing. At this point, John and the gangsters were getting scared. Exdominus drew her ray gun and started firing at the gangsters. Everyone began to scatter, trying to get as far away as possible. One by one, the gangsters were shot down. During the chaos, John got into his car and drove away. After killing the last gangster, Exdominus's wings sprung out and she flew in the same direction as John's car. I sat there, stunned by what I'd just seen. I googled John, and sure enough, he was killed that night. I then read the articles which renowned mythologists wrote. From what I'd gathered, Exdominus is a vengeful spirit who only kills bad people. Murderers, gang members, corrupt officers, you name it. By the end of my research, my skepticism was waning. But there's one thing that kept bugging me. If Exdominus is some being of retribution, then why was Rick killed? I got my answer a few days later. It turned out that Rick was a burglar who stole from houses in different neighborhoods. Suddenly, I remembered something from previous work shifts. For a week straight, I received a call about a burglary every night. The news confirmed that Rick was behind those burglaries. When the news gave the dates of Rick's crimes, I came to a disturbing realization. One of Rick's burglaries happened the same night I saw that figure in the park. I felt my heart sink as I realized that it was Exdominus. For the record, I've never broken the law. The worst thing I've ever done was a fist fight with my old school bully. Other than that, I'm a pretty okay guy. I don't know where Exdominus is now. Sometimes I think I see her hiding in the shadows. To anyone who's reading this, please be careful at night. Sure, they say that Exdominus only kills bad guys, but what if that's not entirely true? If you see Exdominus, run. You never know what someone is truly capable of. I don't know how to feel about what I just experienced. I'm grateful that my health has improved since then, but the circumstances left me with mixed feelings. I was diagnosed with a blood disorder when I was 10. I never learned how to pronounce its name. What I can tell you is that there was no cure for it. All the doctors could do was prescribe me a few medications. The disease didn't affect my daily life. However, the medication took a toll on my family's finances. Every day I hoped for a cure, not just for my health, but for my family too. After 20 years, my prayers had been answered. I was out having drinks with my friend Barry when he told me about this new clinic in town. It was founded by someone named Dr. Cornelius Ravenmoon. He's a hematologist who treats people with blood disorders like mine. Dr. Ravenmoon had a unique method he and his staff used to cure any blood disorder. I was skeptical of this Dr. Ravenmoon guy, but then my friend showed me something on his phone. It turned out that Dr. Ravenmoon had clinics all over the country. There were also some promising reviews. My friend even offered to pay for my treatment. I thought about it and agreed. Barry drove me to the clinic the following day. The clinic looked legit, I'll give them that. Barry and I were setting up an appointment when one of the doctors approached us. He introduced himself as Dr. Ravenmoon. He was pale with dark hair and appeared to be a few years older than me. Barry introduced me and explained my disorder to him. Dr. Ravenmoon claimed that he dealt with my condition before and offered to cure me. I asked the doctor what his credentials were. Keep in mind that I had a blood disorder that had no cure for 2 decades. Then this hematologist I've never heard of claims he can cure my illness. Dr. Ravenmoon understood my suspicion and took me to his office. I've been in a doctor's office enough times to know what an official diploma looks like. When I saw Dr. Ravenmoon's certificates, I felt a little more confident in him. I asked Dr. Ravenmoon when my appointment was going to be. Dr. Ravenmoon told me to come back tomorrow morning in a short-sleeved shirt. I followed his orders and showed up the following day. Dr. Ravenmoon took me to a room and explained the process to me. The first step was to put me under. Dr. Ravenmoon would then insert 2 IVs into one of my arms. One of the IVs would kill the harmful bacteria in my bloodstream. Meanwhile, the other would heal whatever damage the disease caused. I asked Dr. Ravenmoon what the IVs were and why I'd have to be put under. Dr. Ravenmoon explained that the IVs were a secret formula he created. As for the anesthetics, the medication worked more efficiently when the patient's asleep. I know nothing about medicine, let alone IVs. So, at the time, I accepted his answers. I gave Dr. Ravenmoon my emergency contact and we proceeded with the treatment. When I woke up later, I felt a little drained. It took me a moment to realize that the treatment worked. You see, my disorder made my body's temperature 110 degrees 24/7. The only way I could determine if I had a fever was if I had the other symptoms. But when I checked my forehead, my temperature felt normal. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried with happiness. I was smiling as Barry drove me home. I told my parents the good news as soon as I got home. As I got ready for bed that night, I realized that I never thanked Dr. Ravenmoon. Since I had work the next day, I decided to visit his office afterward. That afternoon, I drove to the clinic and asked for Dr. Ravenmoon. The receptionist told me that he was in the middle of a procedure. But since the procedure was almost over, he suggested I wait outside the doctor's office. I thanked the receptionist and made my way to Dr. Ravenmoon's office. I was going down the hall when I noticed something in one of the rooms. There was a doctor with a patient. The patient seemed unconscious and the doctor held his wrist up to her face. I froze when I realized that this doctor was biting into the man's wrist. She then released the patient's arm and I saw the blood covering her teeth. I fled and ran into Dr. Ravenmoon's office. I had to warn him about the crazy doctor in his clinic. Unfortunately, Dr. Ravenmoon wasn't there. I locked myself in and was about to call the police when I saw something. There was a framed news article on one of the walls. The page had a picture of Dr. Ravenmoon shaking hands with another man. What grabbed my attention was how old-fashioned their outfits were. The article was about the first man Dr. Ravenmoon cured. I was examining the newspaper when I saw the date. My jaw dropped when I saw the year 1922. I stepped back, looking at the picture again before looking back at the date. There was no way that the Dr. Ravenmoon in this newspaper was the same one who cured me. I kept backing away until I felt the door behind me. The feeling of its metal handle snapped me out of it, and I exited the office. I then turned to leave when I bumped into Dr. Ravenmoon. As I apologized, I saw a tiny red splotch on his lower lip. I must have looked as if I'd seen a ghost because Dr. Ravenmoon asked me if I was okay. I pointed at the splotch on Dr. Ravenmoon's lip. He wiped it off with his finger and looked at the red substance. Dr. Ravenmoon said that it was cranberry juice. I pretended to believe him and said that I came over to thank the doctor for everything. After that, I got out of that clinic. I'm not sure if Dr. Ravenmoon knew what I knew. In any case, there's no way I'm going back to that clinic. I locked my doors and did some research. The internet claimed that the guy I saw in the newspaper was Dr. Ravenmoon's great-grandpa, but some websites tell a different story. Apparently, there's a species of vampire that can suck diseases out of the bloodstream. I looked down at the bandages on my arm. With a trembling hand, I removed the bandages. I felt my heart sink as I saw the tiny puncture wounds on my wrist. As I mentioned earlier, I felt a little drained after the procedure. At the time, I blamed it on the anesthetics. But after everything I had uncovered, I don't think Dr. Ravenmoon was human. In fact, I don't think any of the doctors in his clinics were human. Like I said, I'm grateful to be rid of my disorder, but it won't make the thought of being a monster's food source any less terrifying. Please be careful if you're in one of Dr. Ravenmoon's clinics. Some things are not as they seem.